Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is you're watching this. This is What's Left. I'm your host. My name is Larry Erickson. And for the next close to half an hour, I'm going to be going on about some things that I think you might find interesting enough to listen to and maybe even do something about. As always, any comments, questions, or reactions, they are always welcome. This is my personal email here, hooviating@aol.com, so you can send me an email if you want, or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be here somewhere around there a couple of times during the show. You can get the email address from there if you didn't run out for pencil and paper, or you can leave a comment there if you'd like. If you do send me email, just as always, two things. One, please include something in the subject line that makes clear this is about the show. It's not spam. And two, be a little patient about getting an answer because I stink at answering email. So with that, let's get to it. I always like to start with some good news where I can, and we have a couple of bits of here, some good news. The first is in an area where there has not been a lot of good news of late, and that's the area of voting rights. Now, 2 weeks ago, I was able to tell you about a court victory for voting rights in Virginia. This week, I can tell you about one in Texas. On March 10th, a three-judge panel of the Federal District Court for the Western District of Texas ruled that several of the state's gerrymandered federal election districts discriminate against minority voters. And so they therefore violate both the Voting Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. This could result in an entirely new map for the 2018 congressional elections, a new map that could give minority voters increased clout. Now, crucially, the court ruled that the Republicans intentionally engaged in racial discrimination in drawing up their map. And that finding is important because it could be grounds for placing Texas back under the pre-clearance requirements, where changes in voting laws have to be approved by the Justice Department. This case has been going on since 2011. In fact, the arguments by the two sides were completed in 2014. It had dragged on so long, in fact, that in December, some of the plaintiffs actually petitioned to the court to saying, would you please make a decision on this? In fact, it dragged on so long that when the decision was actually released on late in the day on March 10th, even court watchers were caught off guard because people had given up on the case. That's according to Michael Lee, the senior counsel for the Brennan Center's Democracy Program. The ruling, which Texas will doubtless appeal to the Supreme Court, was a split one. It was a 2-1 decision. The third judge argued in a dissent that was very strange. First, it dripped with contempt and hostility towards the Justice Department, but argued that the case was moot, even though the majority noted that the issue of mootness had already been dealt with previously. He accepted without reservation the claim of Texas, get this claim, that, oh no, we understand that the districts are gerrymandered, but it has nothing to do with race, because what we were trying to do is trying to make sure we can elect the maximum number of Republicans and not let any Democrats get elected. And saying that made it legal because the Voting Rights Act does not specify that as a cause for action. Happily, the majority didn't buy this nonsense. There are similar cases, 2 of them, in North Carolina that are making their way through the courts that also could potentially impact the 2018 elections. Hopefully, we'll be able to give you some good news on those before too much longer. Now, we also have a matter of good news, or it's like sort of good news. I'm calling it good news with a question mark. A few weeks ago, I told you about an attempt by Bernie Sanders, Amy Klobuchar, and some others to allow pharmacists to import drugs from Canada. And how, despite attracting the support of a dozen goppers for this in the Senate, the move failed because 13 of the Democrats voted against it. One of that demon's dozen, if you will, was Cory Booker, and he took the brunt of the heated reaction because of his status as some kind of liberal hero. Well, the good news part here is that Cory Booker is now on board. He's co-sponsoring a new version of the bill with Sanders and Klobuchar, but so are three other Democrats who previously voted against the bill. Now that means that with the addition of these four, if all of the previous GOPR support holds, they now have 50 votes, and which gives them actually a pretty good chance of getting this passed, at least through the Senate. Now, Booker, as a politician who spends their time sitting in their office dreaming of being president someday insisted that the criticism had nothing to do with the shift. It was rather that he won additional safety measures in the bill because the protection of the American public was really his real concern, not the boatload of campaign contributions he gets from the pharmaceutical industry. Still, he is on the right side now, but this is where the good news becomes the sorta good news. Several of these so-called safeguards in the bill are actually loopholes for big pharma. Two in particular, one relatively minor, the other more important. The minor one is that foreign sellers can only sell drugs manufactured in an FDA-registered facility. Now, this would effectively limit things to the reimportation of drugs that have been manufactured in the U.S. and exported to Canada. But that's not a significant limitation because most of the drugs affected by this would fit that description, which again raises the question for the supposed need for additional safeguards, since you're talking about reimporting drugs manufactured in the U.S., but leave that aside. The other requirement is that foreign sellers of drugs would have to be certified by the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services. What that would mean is that the White House could, in fact, completely block the importation of medications from Canada simply by not getting around to certifying any such seller or finding excuses to deny any application that comes. All of which means that the move to allow the importation of medications from Canada is back on track, but with enough PSs and footnotes to make Big Pharma happy. So yes, this is sorta good news, which is better than not good news, which is what we have next. Specifically, we have the intent of TheRump to turn back the clock on clean water by undoing the so-called Clean Water Rule. Now, the Clean Water Act of 1972 protects the waters of the U.S., meaning major water bodies like large streams, rivers, bays, and other coastal waters, along with streams and wetlands that flow into them. It protects them from being polluted or destroyed, at least without any oversight or control. The question has always been, just how extensive is that reach? That is, just how far does the definition waters of the U.S. extend? The issue came to a head in 2006 in a case, Rapanos v. U.S., which involved a developer who wanted to fill in a wetlands to build a shopping mall. It resulted in a very messy 4-1-4 decision at the Supreme Court, with four right-wing justices taking a very narrow view of what the law encompassed, four other justices taking a more expansive view, and Justice Anthony Kennedy trying to strike a middle ground. In the absence of a majority, the controlling view became that of Kennedy, who said that waters with a significant nexus to those clearly covered by the Act were themselves covered. Which just leaves another problem. What constitutes a significant nexus? The Obama administration tried to answer that question with a rulemaking effort that took over 4 years to get from initial draft in 2011 to final form in 2015. Relying on scientific research, the Clean Water Rule, as it was called, said the law's protection extended to what are called intermittent waters, which are those that only flow at certain times of the year, usually like from snow melt and so on, and ephemeral waters, which are those that flow only in response to a weather event, such as a rainstorm, provided they have other features of a stream like banks and a bed. The support for this position lies in the fact that the EPA says that upwards of 2/3 of U.S. stream miles are intermittent or ephemeral, and that about 117 million Americans, a third of the population, draw all or some of their water from public drinking water systems that depend at least partly on such streams, and that such waters, along with the headwaters of streams, are hydrologically connected. That is, they have a significant nexus with those larger streams and rivers clearly covered by the law. Unfortunately, this rule has never gone into effect because it was blocked in federal court, meaning those waters remain without protection, which is bad enough, but it gets worse. On February 28th, TheRump issued an executive order that not only indicated the administration was no longer going to defend the Clean Water Rule in court, but it ordered the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers, which are the two agencies involved in overseeing and enforcing this, to review and revise the rules. And not just in order to, as was expected, to reverse the Clean Water Rule, but to adopt the standard used by the right-wingers in the Rapinos case. Standards not only weaker than the ones the Obama administration promulgated, but were actually weaker than the ones the Bush administration adopted in the wake of the Rapinos case. That is a standard that would not only exempt intermittent and ephemeral waters from protection, but would even strip protection from wetlands that lack a direct surface flow of water to what are called perennial streams and lakes, those that have water all year round, even though many wetlands have their connections to those streams and lakes through aquifers or through underground sources. It would also deny protection to the headwaters that are, in fact, the sources of all those perennial streams, all apparently under the insane notion that water does not flow downhill and that you can pollute upstream without affecting downstream. The silver lining in this dark cloud is that the Clean Water Rule isn't going away anytime soon. TheRump's order allows the EPA to begin the lengthy rulemaking process, something which the New York Times estimates may take longer than TheRump has remaining in his first term. Even so, this is clearly an indication of the attitude the White House cabal intends to undertake in issues of environmental protection, and likely presages future actions of the same sort along the same line. And that most certainly is not good news. As footnote to that, quick footnote to that, last week I mentioned that among the achievements of the movement of the 60s was to change, perhaps not by much, but certainly permanently, our society's sense of relationship to the environment. Consider as evidence of the fact that even now, TheRump has to talk about wanting clean water and hasn't proposed doing away with the Clean Water Act so that we could go back to the days of Lake Erie being dead, the Cayuga River catching fire, and living in Boston meant you really did have to love that dirty water. Next up, we have one of our occasional features, which is filed under the heading, "Sometimes All You Can Do Is Laugh." On its streaming TV service, Amazon is running an adaptation of a 1962 novel by Philip K. Dick. It's called The Man in the High Castle. It's an alternate history, and the premise is that the Allies lost World War II to the Axis, and the U.S. is now a divided nation with the eastern part of the country ruled from Germany, the western part from Japan, and in the middle there is a strip of relatively lawless neutral territory where a fledgling resistance movement is trying to get started. As part of the advertising for the show, Amazon set up a website called resistanceradio.com featuring 3 looped streams supposedly from 3 pirate radio stations operating in that neutral territory in the show's fictional world. The company also set up a sponsored hashtag on Twitter, #ResistanceRadio. Well, apparently a number of supporters of TheRump heard about this and without even looking at the site, without doing one bit of thinking or checking, stomped over to Twitter to start denouncing this show's liberal bias. and to complain about lefty loonies who would rather the USA fail than admit Trump does anything good and who are resisting facts like Trump is president without even checking. It is true, sometimes all you can do is laugh. And let's take a break. And we're back. And we're back with one of our regular features. This is the Clown Award, given as always for meritorious stupidity. And this week we had 4 contenders. So let's go through them. Our third runner-up is one Steve Fitzgerald, a state senator in Kansas. A woman was dissatisfied with the response he gave to her concerns about recent anti-abortion rights legislation in the state legislature, so she donated money to the regional chapter Planned Parenthood in his name. The organization sent him a thank you, and he responded with a letter calling Planned Parenthood heinous, saying this was worse than having his name associated with Dachau. And shame on everybody, he said, for trying to blacken his name. Yeah, well, I think you're doing a pretty good job of that in your own, Stevie boy. Our second runner-up is Alabama Secretary of State John Merrill. On March 5th, he spoke in support of Alabama's voter ID law. Now, it's bad enough that voter ID laws address a non-existent problem, voter impersonation at the polling place, and are actually being passed with the active intent of suppressing the minority vote. But he made his statement at the Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Selma, Alabama, during a service to commemorate the 52nd anniversary of Bloody Sunday, when police attacked a nonviolent civil rights march on the city's Edmund Pettus Bridge. Now, on the other hand, in 2016, Merrill claimed that automatic voter registration would cheapen the work of civil rights leaders because apparently the way to respect them is to make it as hard as possible for minorities to register to vote. And he called Confederate symbols on government buildings a monument to a way of life that makes us special and unique. So apparently this kind of thing is pretty par for the course for him. Our first runner-up takes us from one dark part of the universe to another, Wall Street. Now, you likely know of the iconic statue of the charging bull that's down there. And as you may have heard, there is a new statue there, that of a young girl defiantly facing off against the bull. It was placed there just before International Women's Day by the management of State Street Global Advisors, which is the world's third largest asset manager. And they did it as a call for companies to include more women on their boards of directors. Now, it's a laudable goal, and the statue has already become a favorite of visitors to the area. So the day after International Women's Day, this happens. Some Wall Street lackey type, who an onlooker described as looking like they came straight out of Central Casting, proceeds to hump the statue while his friends cheer him on. Yeah, crude, boorish, simulated sexual violence. Always good for a laugh. Quick footnote, apparently some people were disturbed by the fact that the photo was being distributed on social media, but according to eyewitnesses, this guy did it not only in front of his friends, but about 15 or 20 other people, so he's got no business for complaining. And as a footnote to the footnote, when Inside Edition covered this story, they blurred the guy's face. I didn't. All right, now who could be more clownish than that? The answer is our winner of the Big Red Nose this week, Time Magazine. Amal Clooney is an accomplished international human rights lawyer who made a powerful speech to the UN General Assembly on March 10th, calling on the world body to investigate human rights crimes committed by ISIS in Iraq, especially against the Yazidis, a religious minority that ISIS regards as devil worshippers to be destroyed, eliminated, wiped out. She specifically called on Iraq's Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, to send a letter to the Security Council, which would enable the Council to vote to begin investigating those crimes. And how did Time Magazine decide to tweet about the story? This way. Yup, that way. They weren't the only ones. But while we might, emphasize might, expect it from outfits like Entertainment Tonight or E! or tabloids like The Mirror in the UK, to see it from such an establishment and mainstream publication as Time just serves to emphasize how deep-rooted and pervasive sexism is and remains in our media. Time magazine, you really have proven yourself to be a complete miniature car full of clowns. All right, 3 brief items now from our occasional feature, For the Record, where we speak about something just very quickly, just to make sure it gets mentioned. First is that the resistance continues. On March 14th, a movement called Resist Trump Tuesdays turned out hundreds of people in places including Kansas City, Medford, Oregon, and some 250 in snow and cold in Racine, Wisconsin, as well as there were other places around the country. Several thousand turned out in Nashville, Tennessee on March 15th in response to an appearance there by TheRump to promote his Let's Kill Public Education program. So, carry it on. Second, for the record, when people tell me the U.S. is the best country in the world, I always ask them, what's the 7th best country? Because if you say we're the best, you have to have some sort of objective standard. Well, it turns out that every year, U.S. News & World Reports puts together such a list. It worked with the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania and a consulting firm to develop a set of standards based on how each country is perceived by the world at large. The U.S. has ranked 7th on that list, a drop of 3 slots from last year, and it ranked that high only because of scoring so high on power, entrepreneurship, and cultural influence. In other words, on the military, corporations, and Hollywood. Outside of those 3, it ranked no higher than 16th on any measure. God bless America. And here's something you hadn't heard about, just in case you haven't heard about this. It's for the record. A company called WeVibe sells a vibrator that can be remotely operated via a smartphone, so you can be together even when you're not, according to the company's commercials. What the company didn't say is that when they sold the thing to a customer, is that the app involved would send to the company's services the date and time the device was used, how and for how long it was used, and the registered user's email address. The company has now agreed to a nearly $4 million settlement in a class action suit. All right, last for this week, some updates on things that I have talked about recently. First, I said a couple of weeks ago that the stench of corruption continues to thicken around the drive to build the Dakota Access Pipeline, or DAPL. It just thickens some more. When the Army Corps of Engineers released an environmental impact statement about the project last August, it included a controversial conclusion regarding environmental justice issues that, quoting, the proposed pipeline would not disproportionately affect identified minority or low-income populations. It now turns out, based on court records, that the source for that bit of supposed analysis was not the Army Corps of Engineers. It was the pipeline's builders, Dakota Access LLC and its contractor HDR Incorporated. And how did the corporation reach that oh-so-convenient conclusion? Not by examining the economic status of the Standing Rock Sioux and the impact an oil leak would have on the community's drinking water and agriculture, but by making comparison to other low-income communities in the state. And because the pipeline would, quoting, cross less than the overall state average of 12% of impoverished populations, that, they said, meant the pipeline does not disproportionately impact low-income populations. And if that wasn't enough of a slammer, the report also argued that the route would impact 1% fewer Native Americans and Alaskan Natives than it previously considered route. So see, no environmental justice issues. In other words, the corporation didn't look at the actual potential environmental and cultural impacts of this project. They just looked at population sizes as if that was the only issue. then that self-serving corporate assessment was largely just wrapped into the Army Corps of Engineers statement. This whole thing just stinks. Next up, last week I referred to my rules for right-wingers, with number 18 being if you lose by the rules, change them. I listed a number of recent attempts by right-wingers to change the rules to shut down public opposition to their regimes. Turned out I missed one. Arizona has seen some progressive victories lately through use of citizen initiatives, including an increase in the minimum wage and a paid leave measure in this past November. So the reactionaries in control of the legislature just want to make it harder for such initiatives to get on the ballot in the first place. One measure would ban campaigns from paying petition gatherers by the signature, which would sharply increase the cost of mounting a petition campaign by removing any incentive for the gatherers to get as many signatures as they can. Goppers claim this is to prevent fraud, but since the signatures are validated in order to get a ballot measure approved anyway, that's obviously bogus. Another proposal, though, which could present even a bigger hurdle, is to require that for a measure to qualify for the ballot, the petitions must have signatures totaling at least 10% of the vote for governor in each and every one of the state's 30 legislative districts. And finally, there's a provision in the state constitution in Arizona that the legislature can't alter a voter-approved measure in a way that would undermine the law's intent. The Goppers are trying to get rid of that provision. All right, finally, last week, I talked about the issue about privacy in a digital age, specifically government intrusion into that privacy. Here's another aspect of that. Court records have revealed that the FBI has recruited and paid technicians at Best Buy's Geek Squad to do deep scans of the hard drives of computers brought in for service and report anything they find sketchy to the FBI. Defenders of the practice argue that when you bring in a computer for service, you allow the technicians access to your hard drive, and if they find something criminal, kiddie porn is the example invariably thrown up, it's their obligation to report it. Which is all true and completely irrelevant, because here we're not talking about accidentally finding some criminal material. We're talking about people actively looking for it. And no, contrary to what I've seen claimed, except for some potential unusual circumstances, you do not have to actually examine the content of deallocated sectors on a hard drive in order to service it. That is, you may be looking at something and see that this is an image file or this is a text file. You don't have to see what the image is or see what the text says in order to do your job. So I have two bits of advice for you. One, encrypt all your data. Two, don't go to Geek Squad. All right, that's going to be it for this week. Something else that I will want to talk about, I plan on talking about it next week, because it's something that has not been talked about enough recently. And that is the business about TheRump wanting a $54 billion increase in military spending. And why has the issue of military spending and the need to cut military spending in order to fund human needs, why has that disappeared from the national agenda? So we're going to be talking some about that next week. For the moment, though, you just have the best week you possibly can. We will see you next week. Spring is coming, I swear. And until then, as always, peace.